Hi, everybody. Hope you're doing marvelously well. I'm sitting here with my friend Steve Klein. Steve, how are you?
Very well, thank you.
Excellent. We are going to talk about proper speaker placement. We couldn't remember where we met, but it was Dave Jordan's a mutual friend of ours because you designed his room, didn't you?
Yeah.
You did Eldorado.
I did, well, yeah, I did all of the Eldorados.
Yeah, which is absolutely fantastic. So we're here today to talk about studio design, which for you is a combination of everything. It's the control rooms and also the live rooms. I mean, it really is studio design. Just off camera, you started to say, well, the first thing you've got to get, and we started talking about monitor placement. So if you were putting together a home studio now, which so many people are doing, they're building studios in probably less than ideal rooms because they've got spare bedrooms or garages or whatever it might be. What are sort of the tips? What do you think are the fundamental things they should be looking for to improve their spaces and make them usable?
To get into the monitor placement, I'd like to help everyone understand how we hear. Because we hear in a particular setup, right? So in the beginning, when we're born, our eyes are not fixed. Our ears are fixed. So in human development as an infant, your eyes align to your hearing. So normal vision, when we just look, people don't sit in a room and look like that. They sit in a room and look like that. That default angle is because our hearing is most sensitive at that angle.
Right.
With that in mind, where should the tweeters be? The tweeters should be at that angle. We're not sensitive to the direction of the woofer. We're sensitive to the direction of the mid-range and top end, specifically the mid-range. So the very first thing we want to understand is that the tweeters need to be at that angle, so that when you're not thinking about it and you're sitting at the listening position and you're not thinking about it at all, you're thinking about dinner or where you got to be or what string chart you're going to try and write, whatever it is, you're not thinking about it. You're just sitting there. You should be staring at the tweeter.
That makes perfect sense.
Yes. So then we get to which is kind of common knowledge. The idea is that we're at an equilateral triangle.
Right.
Just to extend that point, right? For video, it's the same thing. Video is distance away is the distance apart. That's how big the screen can be. Gee, why is that? It's because our eyes are tuned in to our ears. We look in that equilateral triangle. So we hear in that equilateral triangle. Where the big mistake is that they always show the speakers at 60 degrees. They always show the speakers like that. Well, that's not right. What you're doing is you're lowering signal separation. If I were going to sell you a stereo device and I told you that it had 40 dB channel separation, you wouldn't even talk to me, right? You wouldn't consider anything that had 40 dB channel separation. And what happens when the speakers are tilted in is that we are lowering the channel-to-channel separation because the sound is not coming out of the speaker like that. It comes out of the speaker like that.
So you use a much gentler angle.
Right? Yes. So that because we hear fairly omni right at our ear, we need to maintain that channel-to-channel separation. This very simple concept of how the speaker should be set up. You don't see it often enough. Another big problem, right, is this right here. We put the speakers on a board.
Yep.
And then there's companies that say, oh yeah, well, we have these isolators that we put under the speakers. Okay, fair enough. But take two tom-toms, hit that tom-tom. Does that tom-tom make sound? Doesn't matter that they're not touching or whatever. It's still reactive. It's still active in the sound field. You get some benefit from the isolators, and I'm an advocate of the isolators, but it's not a cure for the problem.
So what's the cure for the problem?
On stands.
Stands, okay.
Right? We really need the speakers on stands. Or we need the speakers, if they can be mounted to the wall, they should be can be mounted to the wall. But we want to
like
get
these tannoys are up
right,
here.
right, which is, brings us up to soffits, which is another area of wild misconception. But I'm not a fan of soffits. Where we got soffit-mounted speakers was a throwback to the 70s, where we needed to get the rooms to play louder, and we didn't have the hardware to make them louder, and everybody wanted it louder. So soffit-mounted speakers makes the speakers louder, and compression sealing makes the speaker louder. And hard surface around the speaker makes the speaker louder. Right? Delivers more volume to the listening position. Does it make it more accurate? Is the question. And no, it does not make it more accurate. It's a mess. That sealing, reflective baffles, infinite baffles, all that stuff is a mess. Right, and very rarely see it in professionally designed rooms. Where you see them today is, owner builders are homeowners or whatever it is. They have the picture, but this is where the speaker wants to be. The speaker wants to be in air, and so, a lot of times in the studios, it'll look like it's built in, right? It will look like it's a soffit-mounted speaker, but really what it is a speaker sitting on a shelf with usually fabric-faced. The speaker is not coupled to baffle.
Right.
Right? So we want to get the speakers in air.
Yep.
We want to get the speakers on stands. We want to get the tweeters above our ears. We want them to be an equilateral triangle. We want it aimed behind us and not at us. Right? It should be aimed about 3 feet behind you. Depends how wide a triangle is, but they should be aimed at this point behind you. You figure if you took half of the speaker and you put it and you aimed it so that it was on the outside of your ear, that's about the angle. You don't want to be staring down the throat of the drivers. The speaker doesn't make any direct sound. Doesn't make any sound that goes that way. Right? Sound travels in waves, so the sound comes out of the speaker and like that. And it's well illustrated if you throw a rock into a pond, you see the circles, right? And that's exactly what the sound is doing, right? If you understand that the sound is going to move in waves, or if you're trying to soundproof something, like if we want to soundproof a room, well, if you stuck a hose in the room, where would the water get out? And that's where the sound is going to get out. So the air and water are all subject to the same physical properties, same physical expression, only water weighs more.
So you're saying tweeter above the ears. So the tannoids obviously are dual concentric.
Yes.
So coaxial speakers. So that center of that tweeter is basically above your head height, but it is aiming.
It's a little higher. Well, Mark is a little taller,
Right.
right? How these evolved into this exact position is typically back in this listening position and
Yeah.
not over the
Right.
desk. So because the artists and everybody's out here.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So if you're at the desk, it appears a little high, but if we move it out from the desk, it comes real close.
Right. So basically, it's above, it's pointing down. So the dispersion is wider. So it hits this area in a bigger amount. Otherwise, I suppose if it's doing this, half of it's just going completely above your head. That's essentially your point, yes?
Well, yeah, you bring up a good point in that what happens to the speaker when you change its angle.
Yep.
When and that's
I mean, it feels like a flashlight.
Right.
You're pointing a flashlight down, and as it widens out.
With the coaxial speaker,
Yep.
it doesn't matter because it is time aligned by default.
Yeah.
Right. Where it matters is when you have speakers that have the top end on the bottom and the two or three-way or four-way speakers.
Yep.
As you add angle to it, well, you're now changing the time alignment of the speaker because the top end is going to get to you sooner than the mid-range.
Right.
So with that in mind, I'm not a big fan of having the speakers up there. Very few rooms have high-mounted speakers, high-mounted soffits. None of them have real soffits. I've been successful in talking clients that want that, being able to move them away from that decision, But what that means is that even bigger speakers, rather than placing them higher, we still, try. Most of the time, they end up on stands, even though those stands may be a little higher. I would prefer the speakers to be flat on stands.
Right.
Right. If we put a little bit of an angle on it, we can, but ideally, we want to maintain the time alignment. The speaker manufacturers today spend a great deal of attention to the time alignment of their cabinets. You don't have to get into top-end speakers to have that fundamental design feature. We are very sensitive to the time. We're very sensitive to the horizon. We're not very sensitive to the vertical, right? And believe it or not, we're not very sensitive to the frequency. The fact that so much of this gets reduced to frequency is foolishness. It's really a mystery to me. How did this all become a frequency-driven equation? It's not a frequency-driven equation. If it was a frequency-driven equation, there would be three models of speakers, and that's it. Well, the fact that we have so many models of speakers in the world is pure evidence that this is not a frequency-driven issue. The frequency response of most speakers today is really good. I mean, even $400 self-powered speaker compared to what was available 20 years ago, this thing is a technical marvel. So you can't discount it because it's at a lower price. There's still a lot of technology and understanding and state-of-the-art that's in anybody's speaker. I don't like anybody's speaker. I have very few speakers that I like. There are very few speakers that I like. But I have great respect for all the speakers. Anybody that's making a speaker that is successfully marketing that speaker, there's a lot going on. This is not an easy thing to do, nor is it a haphazard thing to do. They don't get lucky. So I think they got lucky with the NS10, but that was a long time ago. One of the great benefits of having the tweeters like this is that it improves your posture. My thesis, and I say this often, is that what we want to try and do is we want to try and increase the golden time inside of your studio by 15 minutes. There's a time where the juices are flowing, everybody's creative, and things are really happening. And then there's a time where you spend the rest of the time trying to figure out what was happening when everybody was happening. It's sorting it out. But if you can increase that true creative time by 15 minutes, the cumulative effect in your career and in your work is great, right? So if your posture allows you to sit comfortably for 15 minutes longer and think for 15 minutes more, then we've made a great improvement to your life.
You've had the, dare I say, luxury of working with people with budgets and building like this studio, as we were talking with Mark off camera, was purpose built. So it was constructed. So you got to build the control room the way you wanted it to be. And you invested a lot of time and energy into making this an incredible sounding room. Now, but given the knowledge that you have, we've talked about speaker design, most people don't have that luxury, unfortunately, to build purpose-built rooms. What are fundamental things that you think everybody should do to improve their listening environment?
The first thing we've covered.
Yep.
Right? So how those speakers are mounted, their positioning, number one. Then understanding what's happening acoustically is the next step. That's a big step. It's really the reverb times and modal behavior that affect the speaker response. It's not frequency response. It's occurring later in time. So the idea that we can correct the speaker for something that's happening later in time, I don't believe you can.
What are your tips to look out for in the room?
So then if we go back to the mechanics of how we're hearing, how we hear is basically our brain samples in a 20 millisecond frame. Our brain interprets it as the environment and so forth down the line at 20, 40, 60, so forth down the line. So that's what very often you see this in room voicings, hardware and all kinds of different software where, they have time corrections. It starts at 12 milliseconds, 20 milliseconds, and so forth, because this is how we hear. The reflections that are inside of that 20 millisecond window or in the 40 millisecond window, those real fast reflections, those are confusing to your hearing, to your ability to discern what's really coming out of the speaker and what's happening in the room. What we're trying to achieve in the room is that the low frequency should have the longest reverb time. The top end has the shortest reverb time. And how and why that happens is that as the wave is moving, if we look at it as a sine wave, right? As that sine wave goes positive to negative, where it eats up the energy is at the zero line. The more times it crosses the zero line, the more energy is dissipated. So low frequency is real long and carries a lot of energy because it goes through the zero line not that often, 40 times a second, The top end at 10 kilohertz is going through that zero line real fast, 10,000 times a second. The energy of the very top end dissipates quickly. We don't really have an acoustic phenomenon that's happening because the mid-range as an average is falling 3 dB every 6 feet. Our ideal reverb time represents the lowest frequency at the longest reverb time and the highest frequency at the shortest reverb time. The high frequency is basically taking care of itself because it's moving in and out of, passing the 0 point. The reflections in the mid-range where we get our sense of direction and get our masking, these things are happening quickly. So what we're trying to do, we get the area between the speaker and the listener and the area around the listener to have less reflection, so that the mid-range reflections are occurring later in time. You know, if they can occur, if they're occurring after our 20 millisecond mark and 40 millisecond mark, then we're able to perceive that as the sound quality of the environment. If they're happening before that, then we're distorting the sound quality of the speaker because our brain is not making the differentiation.
So given all of that data, what are the things that are common in rooms that you see need to be fixed? And we're talking about, going back to, this room is purpose built. It's not a square box. It's designed with, uneven walls here. So there's no like standing waves coming from left to right. I know we were talking with Mark earlier that there's actually different, underneath this cloth here, there's actually different diffusing material there than there is on the wall that's not opposite, but, essentially opposite because they're angled. So you've done all kinds of things. You have a huge bass trap up there, in the corner here, in an environment that most people these days are working in. Even professionals now are working at home. Budgets are shrunk. There's no longer like $1,500, $2,000 a day just to pay for the studio.
Right.
You'll be happy if you've got $1,500, $2,000 a day for yourself, let alone the studio. So even well-known mixers are mixing in home environments all the time. Some big names. What are the sort of things that big issues in an average sort of bedroom-sized thing that you would suggest to be treated first?
Let's address that point.
Yeah.
Right, about working at home versus working in a studio.
Sure.
Because I think that the whole thing gets blurred.
Sure.
By the fact that people can do amazing things under the worst possible conditions.
Sure.
Right?
I've been in many control rooms in my life that sounded dreadful.
Right.
I made albums.
Right. So there's a overriding factor. The talent is the overriding factor.
Absolutely.
How much talent and drive and inspiration and willingness to do it again do you have? Well, people say, well, I don't need that. I made, Billie Eilish made her record in the bedroom, and what do we need all this for? There's not a whole lot in bedrooms that become problematic. If we can get you into the basic setup where the speakers are off the console, off the desk, tweeters where they need to be, there's so much of it that takes care of itself. Where really, this idea that it gets so blurred, well, you see that people haven't passed step one. They're working against themselves from the very beginning. The speakers are sitting on the meter bridge, tweeters are down there, there's pointed at their nose. I mean, they just start off at the wrong pace. So we can get them, if we can get the very simple things, this is where I do this all the time, and get into the room and get these very simple things taken care of. If we can accomplish getting this message out, we've done a real service to the community. When you're listening to your work and you take it out and you make judgments that, of what you would like to improve, what you need to reduce, how you can make it better. If you need more stereo, then we need to bring the speakers out some and move you away. If your vocal isn't distinct enough, then we need to do something that's making the mid-range clearer, because what's happening is if the vocal isn't clear, then we're getting too much distortion in the mid-range. Do not try and find some magic curve that, do not ask some computer to fix your listening environment. Don't do any of these things. Just move the room and your speakers the best you can in the direction that you want to correct it. One of the big flaws in trying to make it is over-listening.
Right.
And if I could go back on my career, if I could go back in time and change one thing, the first thing I would change is how much I listen to it. You know, I would go home and listen. I'd listen in the car on my way home. We go into the lounge and listen. We make a cassette and listen. We listen on this set of speakers. We listen on that set of speakers. We listen, you know, listen. I'm not even a big advocate of alternate speakers. If you have the ability to work with a great set of speakers and you work in the room all the time and you learn the room, that's all you need to do. A man with one watch knows what time it is.
Sure.
The man with two watches is never sure. Learn what you've got and then understand that it gets mastered. And mastering engineers have their talents. The small corrections that the very fine things that you're listening to when you're actually in the heat of the battle, these things don't show up in the outside world. And what does can often be helped, all right? I won't say eliminated, but helped with the proper mastering. If I could just go off on a tangent for a minute, you know, I taught recording. Records don't sound like records until they're records. So everything deserves its proper place. Meaning that when you're tracking, you're listening, you're getting sounds, you're changing microphones, whatever it is, right? Then that recording needs to be properly mixed. Every song needs to be properly mixed. I'm a big believer of more than once. I think if you have a chance to make your mix and then come back on it, is a great opportunity, and it's a lot easier today than it used to be. And then you have to understand that it has to be mastered. And the mastering in today's world, it's not like it was when we, you know, in the old days, because the way we mastered is we would master one side of the record at a time. How one song goes to another song and its level and it's, right, because your ears have memory. What you hear before affects what you hear now. So the brightness of the song before it and the brightness of the song after it and the tempo and the key and all these things, you know, are all part of the mastering process, because when we mastered it, we'd take the record, put it on, sit there and listen to the record and comment to the mastering engineer, and they had their talents, you know, and they bring that talent is needed to be brought into your project. So you can't, if you're sitting listening to your mix, you have to understand that there is another step, and that step is not necessarily spontaneous or easy. Very often, you know, we have records mastered by 3 different houses, and listen to the you know, who got it best for that record. Back to the over listening thing, you got to be really careful. If you have alternate speakers, the alternate speakers should reinforce what the main speakers are saying to you.
Right.
If you don't like the main speakers, get rid of them. But people pick speakers because they like them, you know. The speaker is not the determining value. This is not a frequency-driven equation.
Steve, thank you ever so much. I really appreciate it.
Did I give you a chance to ask questions? I feel like I might have dominated too much.
No, it's perfect. I mean, really, the question was, where do we put our speakers? So I think we got a lot of details. Of course, there will be links to Steve's site, blogs, all kinds of information down below, which will give you greater depth and clarity. And of course, please ask some questions. Ask some questions down below. Always love reading your questions. Thanks, Steve. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Thanks, everybody. So long, farewell, auf Wiedersehen, au revoir, adios, tutsins, goodbye, ciao, adios.